Hey guys, welcome to the Chapter 8 lecture video. This is on the working stage of group. These next 3 slides are your learning objectives. They are on page 275 in your book if you want to follow along. Okay, so little brief introduction on not just the working stage, but just sort of groups in general. There's no necessarily like distinction between phases. It's not like, well, now we're at our 10th group, we are in the working stage, or it's not like there's some little like formal graduation ceremony that's like you have now moved into the working stage of group. It's not that clear, right? Like you will find groups moving in between, backwards and forwards sometimes in between stages in group, especially like kind of when you're on the edges, when you're kind of, there'll be a lot of like blurred between working and that transition phase, and then like whatever the final phase is. I know it is performing. I guess it's the final stage of group. So in the final stage, right in the working stage, and so you're going to see a lot of like blurring between it, and there will be some regression also. Now it's important to remember that like the working stage is called the working stage, but that doesn't mean work isn't being done, right, in every stage. Not all groups are going to reach the working stage for whatever reason, right? Sometimes it's the group has only 10 sessions and it just doesn't, there's not enough time to get there. Sometimes group members have different things going on that kind of prevent them from moving forward. And another thing it's important to remember is not every individual is going to necessarily be at the same level when they're working. Okay, so progressing to the working stage, we talked about, in the first stage of group, where we're forming, right? We have to do that work where we just kind of like, right, dip our toes in a little bit. We kind of get the feel for things. We kind of like sit back and see what's going on. And then, you go to the transition stage and you're, maybe you're sticking your whole foot in, you're trying things out a little bit more. And we have to go through each stage to get to the point where we're more in the working stage. Again, meaningful work happens at every stage. When we get to the working stage, we're looking at deeper exploration, and the group is working more as like a unit, working together more. Okay, so this slide talks about how we will work through a group member's fears and how it'll look different at each stage. And the book does a great job of exploring each stage. And this starts on page 277 near the bottom. And so it talks about, 279, about at the middle. And so it goes into each like interventions at the initial stage, and then it gives you some lists about, we're basically like encouraging, right? We're not digging deep. We're not kind of like doing as much like calling out or demanding harder work. We're just like building that trust, little kind of things. And then 280 continues the interventions at the transition. We're getting a little bit deeper. We're wanting to look a little bit more. There are some questions here that are a little bit, you can tell, like, what are your fears about? How have your fears stopped you in this room? Like, you can see we're like kind of getting them to think about, what are my fears? What are they about? And how are they affecting my involvement in group? Now, the top of page 281 talks about interventions at the working stage. And It says here the group can get stuck in the transition phase if people do not go further and express reactions that have undermined their level of trust. So it's like if we keep quiet, if we don't talk about those things, then we're not going to make it, right? We need to express the feelings that we keep to ourselves. And in a group, a lot of times there's going to be, we may rehearse what we want to say. We may have a feeling or a reaction to what someone else has shared, but we keep it to ourselves. Like when we get to the working stage, we want to express some of these things more. These things that are usually our internal dialogue, we want to work through them in group. And so on page 281, there's some awesome strategies on how to work with members' fears in the working stage. And then in the final stage, we're kind of looking at more how is what we're learning in group going to help us outside of group, right? How are these changes going to apply? And we do this throughout all of the stages, but we're nearing the end of group. So we're kind of like closing up. And what are we going to do going forward? Alrighty, so tasks of the working group, and there's like 4 slides on this. We talked about group norms and behaviors, and so the norms that were formed in the earlier stage, we're working on getting them more solidified, right? So in the earlier stages, we're kind of working on shaping some healthy norms. Now we're hoping that they are much more, these healthy norms are like more ingrained. They're a bigger part of group. And it's on page 282 where it talks about group norms and behaviors. And one of the things that I like about this, if you can get a group to the working stage, it becomes less work for the group leader because members increasingly interact with one another in more direct ways. There is less dependence on the leader for direction, less eye contact directed towards the leader. So you're always a super important part of group, and you're always kind of watching for things. You're looking for those reactions and those things that aren't said. But if you can get a group to this stage, some of it they kind of help run themselves, right? Characteristics of a working group. Let me find. So this kind of, in the book, they have this slide and the next slide kind of together, and it starts on page 283. So they've got these really, 283 to 285, there's these columns that you can look at, and on the left side, they have characteristics of a working group, and then on the right, they have characteristics of a non-working group. And so it asks some neat questions, and as you're kind of reading through that, I would ask that you kind of reflect on, so like which members' behaviors would act as a trigger for you as a leader? How would you respond? Would you tend to take on all the responsibility for what is occurring in the group? Would you blame yourself, your co-leader, or the members for what is happening in the group? Would you share your reactions with the group? Why or why not, right? And so it's always so important to recognize, who am I? Are there certain things that are a little bit maybe tough for me? And just by being aware of it, we can get out of that like autopilot that drives us to act in unhealthy ways, or sometimes how we usually would handle things, and we can have a more conscious, like, I know that this kind of conflict maybe bothers me, and I have a pretty good plan, right, on how I will handle that. So, an example of like how would I handle when people are focusing on others and not themselves? right? They're not working on their own stuff. They're focused on how am I going to handle that, right? So let's go to that slide. So some characteristics, right, are an undercurrent of unexpressed feelings, right? And we talked about how if we want to get into this deeper stuff, we need to start verbalizing what has usually not been verbalized. Participants can definitely talk about other participants in the sense that, like, how their behavior affects them. And then the last one, right, conflicts are ignored or avoided. That, again, is that undercurrent, right? Those things that need to be brought to the surface. And how do we do that, right, as a group leader? So it sounds simpler sometimes than it actually is, right? Like, it's easier in this setting to kind of sometimes come up with some ideas. It's not always so clear when you're actually leading group what's going on, and that's sometimes where a co-leader can help, and supervision afterwards, right, can really help us to kind of like sort through what was going on. Did I miss anything? But it's little things, just like, I notice when so-and-so talks, you tend to cross your arms and look away. Do you mind to tell me a little more about, what's going on there? Tell me about that. And it's things like just drawing out, making verbal what has been kind of, because that's a nonverbal communication, right? Like, tell me about that. What's going on? So, choices to be made during the working stage, and this starts on page 288. Disclosure versus anonymity. So, they have to decide, am I going to start talking about these things, right? Maybe those things that we kind of rehearse in our head, are we going to keep those reactions to ourselves? Or are we going to start talking about it? Authenticity. So, we want group members to, we want to create, right, a place of trust so that they can be their authentic self and not feel like they have to be so guarded. I was talking about how sometimes we rehearse things, and so we want them to feel like they can have some spontaneity. They can kind of say what's come to their mind versus always like having to put on that face, right, and having to have a lot of control over what they say. Again, we want people to feel like they are accepted, build some group cohesion. And then unity. Unity is what happens when all this work happens, right? The group gets closer, people get closer and feel more comfortable. So homework. Homework is something that can be more formal, like read this, kind of like classwork homework, right? Read this, develop this worksheet. It can also be like trying out a new technique at home, doing a meditation exercise. But the point is the things that we're learning, right, in group, we want them to also be able to take outside of group and practice. So it could be having a conversation with a relative, practicing having it in a healthier way, right, than used to be. And so group is usually, right, maybe we'll say an hour or two out of a week, right? And there's 168 hours in a week. And so there's a lot of hours outside of group that can give people the opportunity to practice what they're learning, right, in the real world. It says in the book, and I definitely agree with this, is homework should be collaborative. It's not us just like, you need to do this, you need to do this. But it's kind of like helping them. It's part of that goal setting, right? Is there something that you would like to try outside of group? Right. It says members can be encouraged to devise their own homework, ideally at each of the group sessions. And if they are willing to create homework and then follow through with that, it enhances their motivation. So it's very important, you know how we said we have kind of like overarching group goals, and then each individual also has their own goals. And so they can easily, right near the end of the session, maybe as like a way of summarizing and wrapping up, is, you know, what is something you got out of group and what is something you can do outside of group this week, right, to kind of help reinforcing what you're learning. So these are the therapeutic factors that operate in a group. And if you are looking in your text, these start on page, the bottom of 291, and it's quite lengthy. It goes all the way to 308. I'm not going to go over all of these. The book does a super great job of going through each of these things, giving you some kind of guidance and examples on how to do some of these things. So, you know, it's a lot of reading, so read a section or two, maybe take a break. That's what kind of works for me anyway. Okay, so we do want to talk a little bit about the self-disclosure piece. So, self-disclosure is something that I know a lot of, at least for me it was, but in a lot of kind of newer clinicians share about how it's kind of like, what do I do? How much do I disclose? Like, what's appropriate? And a good rule of thumb for me is kind of like, what purpose is this serving? Whose needs are being met? So one kind of general rule of thumb is we should always have a reason, a more therapeutic reason. So if we take a minute and we think, why am I doing this? Am I sharing about myself because I'm nervous? And when I get nervous, I talk about, right, too much maybe. Then that would be, right, an unhealthy disclosure and something that would maybe be saved for your own therapy or supervision. Maybe we're self-disclosing because we want to help normalize an experience that somebody's having. Maybe we want to kind of create more of that therapeutic rapport and connection. But it should always be very kind of not necessarily like really like long thought out, because you don't always have that much time, but it should be like, I'm doing this and there's a therapeutic reason. So if you think about it in a group setting, a lot of those same questions that we're asking our group members to share, like, what was it like when so-and-so, you know, shared about their childhood trauma? How did that make you feel? Or, you know, we're expressing those typically not expressed feelings or the things that we're noticing in group. And we want to encourage, right, our group members to start doing that with each other without our intervention. And sometimes a part of our intervention might be, you know, we may say, wow, I really felt, I can really feel that tension in the group, right? Can you guys feel that too, right? So sometimes we may self-disclose what we're noticing to get kind of a conversation going and to model, right, how that should be done. So giving feedback, that starts on page 297. So it says feedback occurs when group members or leaders share their observations and personal reactions regarding the behavior of another. So there can be some overlap with that use of self-disclosure. But feedback, right, we want to be honest and sensitive. We don't want to just be like super necessary. I mean, I'm not saying like we don't want to sugarcoat things, but we don't also want to just be kind of blunt and mean, right? But it needs to be straightforward and in a very useful way. Let others know how their behavior affects you, but avoid being judgmental and avoid giving global feedback. There's a little tip down here on near the bottom of 297. Members are more likely to consider feedback that may be difficult to hear when it is balanced between positive or supportive feedback. So, I've sometimes heard, like, if you sandwich, you say something positive, kind of like maybe, I really appreciate you kind of putting yourself out there, but I noticed, maybe some incongruency, right? Something that we're saying, like, we noticed maybe your facial expression didn't match what you were saying, or something, right? And then you can kind of finish up with something again like that. I know that must have been hard for you, right? Like, I just want to. So you're kind of like smushing it sometimes in between some more positive things, but it gives you some more. There's several bullet points here that give you some kind of suggestions on how to do feedback. Catharsis in group. So if somebody has like a lot of pent up emotions, things that they've been holding on to for a long time, and this is on page 304, and they kind of like let that out, and they're like, whoa, like that felt good to get that out. That is that like catharsis. And so that's not the only way of like, we don't want to strive for those necessarily all the time. If it happens, that's super cool, but it's not the only way, right, that people learn. And so sometimes people can feel a little icky after that because they've let out the stuff they've probably been holding on to for a long time. So it can be really important to kind of take a minute and reflect on and help them to think about, what was that experience like for you? Can you reflect on how you might feel a couple days from now thinking back on this event? Like, because sometimes people will later, they'll be like, oh my God, I'm so embarrassed. I shouldn't have shared all that. And they'll start to kind of feel that like icky guilt and shame. So we want to like kind of like, hey, like if they can recognize that they might do that, we want to go ahead and help them now work through that. Okay, so now we are to page 308, co-leader issues during the working stage. So it's important between group sessions to kind of like have like a little debriefing. Let's talk about reactions, kind of plan on, what can we do to kind of help people move forward. And just kind of like, we don't just want to show up for group and do group, but we also want to talk about group outside of group and what are some interventions we can do? What are we noticing, and how can we make some things better? Alrighty, so member functions. So this is what we want members to be doing at the working stage. Bring into group sessions issues they are willing to discuss. Offer feedback and remain open to feedback. Practice new skills and behaviors in daily life. Be willing to take risks. Continually assess their satisfaction with group. And then the leader functions. We want to continue to model appropriate behavior, support members' willingness to take risks, and assist them in carrying this into their daily lives. Interpret the meaning of behavior patterns at appropriate times. Explore common themes. Focus on importance of translating insight into action. And promote behaviors that will increase the level of cohesion. So thank you guys so much for listening, and have a wonderful day.